I don't know if you noticed, it's not eating the cookies, it's biting the heads off of all of them.
Hey everybody, welcome to Suspenders of Belief. I'm Traby.
And I'm Heavy.
Tonight we watched a movie called Gremlins. Now, this is a movie that came out in 1984 and was very influential, not just on like the industry as a whole, in terms of like people emulating the style of it with like the creature feature aspect, but also the rating systems.
So in case you've never seen Gremlins, Gremlins is I guess you'd call it a creature movie, where it's almost like a child's first horror film. It's a really weird category to figure out. But essentially, a father who is an inventor out on one of his travels comes across this really cute little creature that's called a mogwai, and he decides to buy it to take home to his son.
Whenever he picks up the mogwai, he's given very specific rules about how to take care of them, and they seem kind of strange and arbitrary. And Hoyt Axton, who plays the dad, he's all like, "Yeah, sure, kid, whatever, Merry Christmas." And it's kind of ominous because those rules are very important, to the point where if they are not obeyed, this little adorable little creature can ultimately transform into lots of nasty creatures, and that's basically the general plot. And then shenanigans ensue once the gremlins pop up.
And it's a great film because it's almost a hubris, so to speak, of having something that's sweet and pure and innocent become out of control from being irresponsible and not maintaining the order and the balance and those rules that you're supposed to follow. So it has this nice little story to it. But again, as we mentioned, some of the character moments that really feel off. You have the next door neighbor who is violently racist, and so much so that he just looks for like any excuse to complain. At one point he's like channel flipping and he comes across the Spanish channel and he's like, foreigners.
Regardez-moi. Il nous reste encore un mois. M'écoutez-vous, Orphée?
It's not the TV's fault.
It borrows from this kind of trope of Eastern mysticism that is a thing in American stuff, where it's all like, oh, it's from they're more magical than us. It happens with everything, not just like from China or things from China, but also from like Native American stuff or African American culture. Like, oh, these ethnic people. How many times in like a horror movie where there's a ghost, there's a Spanish Mexican Catholic nanny who comes in and she's like, oh, I sense spirits, and it's like, oh, this other person, this other culture is more in tune with nature than us. That's kind of what they're borrowing from.
Remember, we had two examples of that from Devil Dog. There was the Hispanic lady who walked in and was like, that dog is evil, and then he goes to see like an occult specialist. So like, yeah, we had two from one movie. It's
a recurring thing, and that's kind of what this is aping off of, at least to begin to set it up. Like, where does this monster come from? I don't know, Chinatown, whatever. And it's like, it's not insulting, especially because like the people who are at fault are the white people who don't, like you said, don't know how to deal with this thing in a responsible way. So it's not necessarily saying something about that culture. It's just kind of an old trope that's a little tired. In 1984, it wasn't as tired. This movie's also a B movie, basically. It's the same situation with Jaws. Jaws was just a B movie where it was like, in the 50s we made giant monsters, or we had different creature features or whatever. And Jaws was like, what if giant shark, but we made the movie good. Gremlins isn't necessarily exactly the same thing. It is an old B movie that it's borrowing from, but it's just they're having a lot more fun with it. And the director, Joe Dante, has directed horror before, so he has some experience with giving at least a reasonable amount of tension to a lot of the scenes. And I think that it's a weird tone because the movie's all over the place.
Yeah.
It's genuinely funny and cartoony in some moments, and other times I feel like there is kind of a feeling of dread when the gremlins are at least hinted at. Usually when they're on screen, it's a party town. Like it's really a good time. But when they're not on screen, that threat of them is there, and I think that would mixes up the tone a little bit. But it is ostensibly an old B movie updated for the 80s.
And the Gremlins as a character, you could almost group the like three separate ones. There's Gizmo, who never becomes a gremlin, but people often refer to him as a gremlin because that's the title of the film. You have Spike, or Stripe, whichever one is in this film. I get them confused all the time. And then you have everybody else. Like, the rest of the Gremlins don't have a lot of personality. They do have individual gags, which are hilarious, whether they're making references to movies, TV shows, doing skits, just doing random bits. They do have fun little personality moments, but not like characters. They're just making gags for the audience, basically.
When they did the sequel, the artist who designed the puppets gave them a lot of character, especially with that initial 5 Mogwai.
Yeah.
2 of them are based off of mice and men, and one of them is just bananas. And then you have, instead of Stripe in that one, is Mohawk, and he's like way more sinister. Even as a Mogwai, he's terrifying in that one. As they went along, they got a lot more variety with the different Mogwai and Gremlins by extension. But this first one, you're right, there really are just 3 core concepts. There's Stripe, Gizmo, and everybody else. there's a lot of changes here and there. And I always like to think of the thought process of the gremlin. Like, what is it thinking it's doing right now? Like the one that puts on a ski mask. What was he thinking? I need to put on a mask so she doesn't recognize me? It's like he's probably emulating something he saw on TV, but it's still fun. Or like when the place is burning down and you have the one in like a surgical mask with a knife who's like cackling. Like, what bit is he doing while he's dying? It's great.
It definitely feels like they've watched a lot of television, because even Gizmo does the same thing. Both in the first and in the second movie, he emulates some of the things that he's seen on television to how to handle the situation. And it's one of those films that you can almost feel the meddling when you really look at it with like a surgical eye. Like even the character of Billy is really inconsistent, where there's moments where it feels like, is this supposed to be a child? Is he a teenager? Is he a young adult? Because it's all over the place. You know, the fact that he's living with his parents, but also having a job, but his best friend is like a 10-year-old, and the first person he goes to as an expert for this animal is his science teacher. Like, if you really think about some of these choices, it's a little odd that he's cast as a young adult. But even after watching the film, I'm not sure if he's supposed to be 16, 17, I don't know.
Makes sense for him to be post-high school and just still kind of living with his folks and working at the bank and trying to figure out what he wants to do with his life. That kind of lines up pretty well. But you're right, there are a lot of moments in the movie where it's like, this would make a lot more sense if Billy was like 10 or 11. Mm-hmm. You know, his friend coming up to his bedroom while he's changing, you know, is a little weird. But then, like, you think about it like, oh, well, he's got a bedroom full of comics and paint everywhere, and it makes sense that he'd bring his friend over to show him his new pet, and the friend knocks, you know, water on him. Like, a lot of that stuff lines up. Him, a 10-year-old, immediately thinking, oh, this is an interesting science thing. I'm going to talk to my teacher. They did the same thing in Stranger Things when they had in the second season, when they had the little Demogorgon slug guy, when they brought him in, the same kind of beat. So that kind of aligns, and it makes me wonder, I've never read this before, but it makes me think that in an earlier version of the script, the idea was that Billy was like 10, and as the script changed and evolved, they aged him up and gave him a girlfriend and, you know, had him drive a car and things like that made a little more sense for an older character. So maybe that's the case, I'm not sure.
Well, there are other specific moments that would make more sense if he was a child. When he's at the police station and he's trying to tell the police that these are a threat, there's creatures out there, and they just like laugh in his face.
Gremlins, huh? Little monsters.
Right.
Hundreds of them.
Well, I'm not sure. Maybe thousands.
Wow.
You know, if he was a 12-year-old or like a little 10-year-old telling this crazy outlandish story about monsters running around the streets, it makes sense the reactions that they give. Like, oh, okay, yeah, sure, there's little crazy monsters out there. But, you know, unless we're supposed to assume that Billy's like the boy who cried wolf situation, where he's also made false claims, like, it's very odd for the police to react to a young adult. Look, there's a situation out there, you need to go deal with it. Though, I mean, we do see later that they are the most bumbling cops ever, that when they're right in front of them and someone is actively being attacked, they're like, just drive away, just go, I don't want to be here.
Frank, I really think we should go now. It's kind of funny, Frank. Do I should start the car? Because I'd really like to go back to the station.
Isn't that your job? Aren't you police?
What I didn't realize going into this is we're seeing the origin of Jonathan Banks' character from Breaking Bad, because after, you know, this happens, he has to leave town and go work for Gus Fring at the chicken plant.
He got laid off after he refused to help the people of the town that he was supposed to be protecting.
Right, yeah, and he was in that car crash with the sheriff. The sheriff died. There's a whole investigation and everything. So yeah, it makes sense.
There's also the ending scene where the original owner, the Asian old man, comes back to pick up Gizmo, and there's this moment where Billy, rather than trying to appeal to the Asian man, like, no, he's my pet, you know, please sir, you can't take him away, like, rather than talking to him directly, he calls out to like his dad, like, Dad, you're gonna let him take him? Which again has that more childlike sort of feel to it. If he was a small child appealing, like, Dad, you can't let him take him away, as opposed to him himself making the appeal, like, no sir, you can't take him. It's just a more childish sort of approach.
Most of the movie would be unchanged if he was, you know, 10. You could even have him have like a 10-year-old girlfriend. It would just be, I guess, blocked a little bit differently or staged a little bit differently. Like, they wouldn't work together. There would be something at school they would meet, or she wouldn't work at a bar, obviously, but there'd have to be some other thing. Obviously, you know, they had different ideas that put in, and then they had to age up the characters, I'm guessing. But most of it functionally would work. Here's an interesting question. Do you think the movie would be as popular if it was a kid protagonist? Do you think that would hurt it?
Well, this was pre-Home Alone, but it does have some Home Alone feel to it, which is kind of funny funny when you think about the fact that Chris Columbus wrote the script for this movie.
Yeah, the future director of Home Alone.
Yeah.
I mean, there were stuff in the 80s where there were kid protagonists, like we were talking about the Goonies. It's not unheard of for that to happen. I think Invaders from Mars was a remake that Tobe Hooper did in the 80s with a kid protagonist in it, but I don't think that one did very well. So I don't know. I don't know if it was necessarily a good or bad call. Most people, I guess, would say it was a good call to make him an adult because it's just easier for the audience to identify, the general audience of adult people, especially because who is this movie made for? It's got lots of teeth to it to push it into our territory, but the 13 rating I don't think existed at that time. So there's a lot of moments where feels like they scaled it back, or I've read that they had scaled it back, and it makes me wonder if that was only so that they could get a lower rating to get more seats, to get a better box office, but I don't know for sure.
It definitely has that meddling sort of feel where people were trying to soften those teeth just a little bit. You know, you have the teacher who dies in the lab from his hand eaten to death. I still don't know why or how he died.
My only weakness.
You have a shot of like a needle in his butt. Like, did that kill him? Was that post-mortem? I have no idea. That gremlin's also the only one we don't see if he actually gets any comeuppance or if he's still out running around. We don't know.
Oh, yeah. Presumably, you know, when the third act kicks in high gear, when all the gremlins are running around, he just ran around with them and then ultimately ended up at the theater. But yeah, it's never explicitly shown what happened to that guy.
So one character we absolutely have to discuss, though, who is just the highlight of the film, absolute, just beautifully written, is the mother. I love everything about her sequence, because in a lesser movie, she would be the first victim, right? She's home alone. You get the phone call from Billy, Mom, you got to get out of the house, kind of thing, right? You have that set up, and it's like, oh, okay, she's going to be the first one killed to prove the situation has escalated and that it's serious. But instead, you have her who's home alone, and even before she gets the phone call, you know, she hears some kind of strange noise going upstairs, and she grabs a knife, like, nope, not in my house. Mom, don't take no crap. And then you see her, like, completely destroy 3 gremlins on her own, and it's just a beautiful sequence. It's beautiful.
It's really, really great. It's such a subversion, and it's so much fun because you have all these different ways in which she murders them. It's just so fun to just go through it beat for beat. You know, we were talking about, like, her going for a knife feels out of place, but it's like, I was thinking I would do that, but I'm like, I watch a lot of slasher flicks. So it just occurred to me while you were talking, like, it'd be funny if earlier in the movie, when she's watching It's a Wonderful Life, instead of that, she was watching Halloween, the Jamie Lee Curtis movie. So she's got slasher movie on the brain. So when she hears a noise upstairs, she's like, oh, I've seen this movie. And she pulls out a knife, and that's what she's doing. She realizes she's in a movie.
It's great, too, because it's a woman in her own house, and maybe it's a cliche that she uses, like, the kitchen as the area to take them all down, but she takes them all down with, like, household appliances. It's like a blender, it's a knife, and a microwave. Like, those are the ways that she takes down 3 gremlins, and you know what? I don't care if it's cliche. It's freaking hilarious.
If you were to do this again, you know, in a rote, we did it again kind of 80s style sequel, which didn't happen with this, by the way. It would be like, okay, we're going to have the scene, but now it's going to be the dad in the garage, and he's going to kill him with power tools or whatever. You know, that would be beat for beat if you're making the same thing over again.
There was a sequel, but it definitely tread new ground in the most spectacular sort of way, so we'll definitely have to save more detailed discussion about that for another day. But that does kind of bring into the final synopsis, the end of our Christmas month. So this question, after watching Gremlins, is it a Christmas movie?
For me, definitely no. It's set around Christmas, and unlike Die Hard, where I totally understand the argument that this movie couldn't function nearly as well if it wasn't set during Christmas time, in this movie you could cut out all the Christmas elements and it would be just fine. It's still, Gizmo is given to Billy as a gift, but it could have been any other scenario, I guess. It could be his birthday, it could be whatever.
It's actually one of those that I would almost make the case that if you had, let's say, Billy's birthday is just on Halloween, and Halloween is the seasonal setting, so instead of having Christmas lights, you've got Halloween decorations. Instead of having carolers, you've got trick-or-treaters. Like, substitute a couple of little things out, and it not only works, but arguably works better. Because if this movie had been a Halloween movie with these crazy little critters and monsters, it wouldn't have that juxtaposition of, like, Christmas and monsters, because you do have that. It doesn't feel like Christmas. Even though it takes place at Christmas, it doesn't have that kind of Christmas feel to it. And as much as I like Gremlins, I mean, Gremlins is a fine movie, I don't think of it revolving around Christmas, despite the fact that Gizmo himself is a Christmas present. That we could pretty easily, write that around.
Yeah, it adds a little extra texture to it, a little extra flavor by having it set during Christmas. It's the Shane Black-isms of it, like Iron Man 3, put it in Christmas, whatever. Like, it's just not necessary, but it's just something to add a little flavor to it. And it would have been interesting if this movie had been set during Halloween, because it would have been everybody's favorite Halloween movie, because it would have flowed more naturally into it. Because like you said, I could see it in my head, the trick-or-treating scene where, you know, they're in costumes, like they went to the store, like in the actual movie, they went and got caroling costumes, but they go and get like actual cheap Halloween costumes and, you know, trick-or-treat and try to get candy, and maybe somebody stuffs them and they take off the mask and attack or something. Like, that could work.
The film is great. Even, you know, the little cracks that show up, like, I can't tell you how many times I saw the puppeteering sticks and I literally never noticed them before, or like the strings on top of their head to make their animations a little bit more articulate. It was just, had never noticed them, and now I'll never not see them.
For every bit like that, there are also little subtle things, like after Billy asks Kate out on a date, in the next scene when he's at his house, he's drawing a portrait of her on his little notepad, like, and it's not explicit, they don't linger on it, but you can totally tell that's what he's doing, like little bitty details somebody cared enough. Or like when the gremlin in the school, after he transforms and he's running around, he accidentally smacks into like a stool or something as he's running around in the dark. Like, just little touches like that are fun, like just to give it that extra feel of this is the real world, even though it's a cartoon for so much of the movie.
It does go back and forth though. Like, there are times where you'll notice like little feet print in the dust, or handprints on the wall or the ground or in the snow, and they're so nice. But then it makes you wonder, like, how do they not notice when, you know, a puppeteering stick is in frame if they're being so meticulous about some of the other details?
It's very much if you were to cut out all the footage of Gremlins being directly on screen, you wouldn't have much of a movie, but it would all be implied. And I think that's part of the reason why I was creeped out by it when I was a kid, because when it's that feeling of dread, when it's the implication of a monster, it's a lot more unsettling than just, oh, it's a cool puppet on screen, I can even see the strings, you know, like, it's not scary. But when you're hinting at it, I think it's a lot more effective, and that's how you make I feel like that works well for not every horror movie and not every horror genre or take on different things need to be like this, but when you can successfully imply something and the audience has to imagine it themselves, it's oftentimes more effective than any kind of effect that you can do. But that just depends on case by case.
Yeah, your brain will oftentimes make something more terrifying in your mind than anything they could actually create on screen, which is why a lot of times in horror movies, when they cut away and you just hear like the sounds of something horrific happening, it's so much more visceral. Even the original Psycho movie, the shower stabbing sequence, people still recall that they remember seeing the knife stabbing the body, and that's not in the film. There is no shot of her being stabbed whatsoever, but because that scene is so intense, that people have imagined it so deeply that they convince themselves that they did see it when they didn't.
Yeah, it's really interesting going back to that. There's a lot of movies in that case where people remember it being way more horrific than it actually was, but that's a sign of it being that effective, and it's cool. I appreciate stuff like that.
Well, you know what's great too is the ending of the film. The last couple of lines are almost like an ominous warning. You know, like, before you call the electrician, you know, check all the under the beds and turn on all the lights. You know, there just may be a gremlin in your house. And it's kind of unsettling, and it's a nice little, you know, nugget to end the film on. But I will say it's really good that gremlins don't exist. Because, I mean, could you imagine? That'd be annoying.
Yeah, they'd be terrible. Little annoying little jerks running around messing up my stuff.
Yeah.
I just got this new TV and I've been playing video games on it. They'd probably mess that up.
Right, you know. And hey, what? Hey, get off of, hey, stop it! Ah! Stop it!